To welcome everyone to our program, I'd like to start off by saying how grateful I am to be teaching, learning, and living on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. It's through learning from and with them in the best practices of caring for the land that we're on that helps inform education, conservation, and research at Oceanwise and bring programs like today's to you. And so I'd like to introduce our Vice President of Research, Dr. Peter Ross, to start off our program.
Thanks, Danica. Well, delighted to be here. This is an exciting adventure. This is the first time that we at Oceanwise have hosted our Ocean Awards in an online format. So thanks to everyone for joining us with this, this experiment in learning and sharing and communicating during a tumultuous time in modern human history. I'm really delighted to present today Dr. Philippe Tortell, who is this year's Murray Newman Research Award winner. And that reflects his significant work and his career conducting research in support of ocean conservation. The Ocean Awards were launched in 1995 as a tribute to the founding director of the Vancouver Aquarium, and that was Murray Newman. He had retired earlier in that decade. They continue, and I'm very excited to be able to relay to you that we're actually proud to deliver the 25th annual awards this year, so this is a rather significant milestone for us. Dr. Tortell from the University of British Columbia, as announced at our June 8th gala online, is this year's winner of our research award. And coming from our research department, this is not insignificant. We are always tremendously excited about our Murray Newman Award winner in the research category, and Philippe is very deserving. I will just recount very lightly on the rationale behind that nomination and that award, and hand it over to Dr. Tortell for really what today is all about. That's a chance for him to share with you a personal and professional reflection on where he has come from, where he is today, and how he's looking ahead through the lens of his training and his personal experience. So Dr. Tortell is given the Ocean Award for Research this year for his contribution to ocean climate and biogeochemical research and his steadfast commitment to energetic public engagement on the urgent topic of climate change. Google Dr. Tortell. I will post a couple of links in the chat as he's talking to a couple of publications that may serve as very interesting fodder for reading at your leisure. But today, it's really to celebrate Philippe Tortell, his career. He is at the University of British Columbia. He's the chairman of the UBC Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Somebody has a dog barking, and it might just be me. So I'm going to cut short my introduction. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Tortell today, and we'll follow up after his presentation. So over to you, Dr. Tortell. First of all, congratulations yet again, and thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Peter. It's happy. I'm pleased to hear the human and canine enthusiasm in your background. So what I'm going to do is to start sharing my screen when I figure out how to do that. Let's see. I think I should be the host now. There we go. I got that. Great. So I am really pleased to be with you and to take the opportunity to share, as Peter said, a little bit about my work over the last number of years, and I have woven a little bit of information about my personal journey, how I came where I was, and some of the things that have informed my outlook on research, but also in life. So that the formal title that I think we've given was Ships, Satellites, Supercomputers, and Social Media: How We Understand Arctic Climate Change. But I think a shorter title that would be perhaps just as apt would be Seeing the World Through Different Eyes. And as you'll see over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I've come to see issues of climate change in the Arctic through a number of different eyes. But I'll just start at the beginning, or close to the beginning, and tell you a little bit about the first set of eyes through which I saw the oceans, and they were not my own. I can't see the chat now, but I'm hoping that at least some of you, if not all of you, will recognize this individual, who I think is perhaps one of the most influential people to stimulate interest in ocean sciences, at least of the last 5 or more decades. This is Jacques Cousteau. For those who don't know, a very, very famous French, originally he was a naval officer, and then he became a really important figure in the world of marine research and conservation. He was an inventor, a scientist, an author, a filmmaker. And it was through watching his documentaries and his magical undersea footage that myself, and I'm sure many, many others in my position, found their way into a passion for ocean sciences. So it was really through the eyes of Cousteau and those who worked with him in the 1950s and 60s and 70s that I became deeply fascinated with the ocean world around. My own early years were spent bouncing back and forth across continents and oceans. I was born in Paris in the early 1970s. I lived there for just a couple of years before moving to Montreal at the age of about 2. And I stayed there for about 4 years, and then I bounced back over the ocean and spent a year in North Africa in a small town in Algeria where my father was working. And after a year, I bounced back across the Atlantic, and I landed in Ontario, a small town outside of Toronto, where I spent the next 7 or so years until I was a mid-teenager. Then we jumped back over the pond, so to speak. For 3 years, I went to high school in Rome, in Italy, and had a really interesting educational experience, frankly, much of which did not involve science. Science preparation I had in high school was, well, it was pretty thin, let's just say. But it did open my eyes and my worldview to the notions of history and arts and culture that have stayed with me all of these years later. And as a high school student in Italy, my dreams for university were to come and study at the University of British Columbia. By then, I already knew that I had deep interest in ocean science, and knew I wanted to come back to Canada, and UBC seemed like the place to do that. I was accepted to UBC, but I didn't have a spot in residence, and even back then, housing issues were still somewhat front and center. And my brother was at McGill at the time in Montreal, so I decided to just go back to the eastern part of the country, and I did my undergraduate degree in biology at McGill. And when I finished, I thought I would try once again to make my way out to the West Coast to study at UBC. And once again, my dreams were thwarted. I was unable to find a suitable position. And so that path was at least temporarily blocked. So I set my sights south and east a little bit, and I went down to the United States, where I conducted a PhD in New Jersey. And then wrapping up there, I tried for a third time to come back to Canada and to UBC in particular, and that time was actually successful. And so here I've been since 2002, coming on almost 20 years now, and it's been a pretty remarkable 20 years for me. I have worked with people from all around the world, and really enjoyed getting to know this part of the world and to make it my home. So much of what I'm going to describe here is the path that I've followed over those 20 years of developing my professional and my personal interests. In addition to moving across continents and oceans, my work and my intellectual development, if you could call it that, has also moved across time and space. This little graphic is the last figure that appeared in my PhD thesis. It's a schematic that shows on the x-axis or on the horizontal axis a logarithmic scale of time that goes down from nanoseconds. And so everything is referenced to days. So a nanosecond is 10 to the minus 14 days, all the way up to geological epochs, where we're talking about tens of millions of years or more. On the vertical axis or the y-axis, we have logarithmic scaling of space, down from the very smallest scales of interest to us in biology, where we're talking about the wavelengths of visible photons, visible light particles, all the way up to the spatial scales of the entire Earth system, where we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of kilometers. And within this diagram of both time and space, we can see a whole variety of different fundamental processes that shape the way that the Earth system works, all the way down from things like photochemistry on the very smallest timescales and spatial scales, where we're really looking at the heart of life, the engine of biochemical life. And of course, the details here don't matter, but what I'm showing you is a schematic representation of a photosynthetic reaction center, where light is absorbed and electrons are stripped off of water and carried through a variety of biochemical carriers, ultimately to produce the energy that powers not just photosynthetic organisms, but in fact, most of life on Earth. If we zoom all the way out, we can see that this process of photosynthesis that happens on nanometer timescales and microsecond or picosecond, nanometer spatial scales and microsecond timescales, when we allow it to express itself over long periods of time and over large spatial scales, leads to these emergent properties of ocean ecosystems. This is an image of composite satellite data from one of the NASA satellites. This is what's called a false color image of global chlorophyll concentrations. Chlorophyll is a pigment, a light harvesting pigment that is involved in this photon capture. And the blue, the greens and the yellows and the reds are high concentrations of chlorophyll. So here, for example, all throughout the Arctic, as we'll be seeing, and through parts of the equatorial waters and near the coasts, as compared to these very deep blue and almost purple representations here that represent low concentrations of chlorophyll. And so my interest began to really span this wide range of time and space scales, trying to understand biophysical processes underpinning the fabric of life, and looking at how those processes scale up in space and time to give us the emergent properties that we see in the Earth system. We're going to focus for the next little while on the Arctic. I suspect that all of you will know that the Arctic is a region where climate changes are most profound and most rapid. On the left, we have an image of what's called the temperature anomaly. So this is the warming observed in the northern hemisphere relative to a long-term sort of 40-year average. All you need to know here is that the more orange and red color, the faster the rate of warming, and we can see this so-called polar amplification, where we've got disproportionately high warming in the Arctic region. So this is North America here, for example, and this is Eurasia, and this is over the Arctic. And that warming has been associated with a strong decline in sea ice. This is the current extent of winter maximum sea ice, as opposed to this line here is the 2018 sea ice, This white is the border of the 2018 sea ice minimum at the end of summer, and this yellow line here represents the long-term average. And so the difference between this white area and this yellow line represents the amount of melt that's happened over the last number of decades. So it's a system that is changing profoundly. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how we can use our different eyes, our different viewpoints, to understand the changes that are unfolding across this system. And as the title would indicate, we're doing that with ships, satellites, supercomputers, and social media. So I'll step through each of those quickly, giving a couple of examples of the tools that we might use to answer some of these questions. Let's talk first about ships. I know that these days in general, and perhaps even in these COVID times in particular, people are not really carrying cash. But the next time that you happen to come across a $50 bill, flip it around, take a look at the back. And on the back, you'll see a picture of this research vessel. This is the Canadian Coast Guard ship Amundsen, and it is one of the main oceanographic vessels used for Arctic work in Canada. And some of the results that I'm going to present are from this very ship. Now, if you were to go down below the waterline here to somewhere around here, right, kind of where this M is, more or less, to the front starboard side of the boat, if you were to walk down there, you would see a laboratory that looks something like this. So this is a little small space, maybe, I don't know, 6 meters by 4 meters or something across. And this is the way that that laboratory looked in July of 2015 when we conducted a research cruise on that ship from Quebec City to Gjoa. All of these different wires and tubes that you see are related to sensors, chemical sensors that we had installed on the ship. And these sensors enabled us to measure a variety of different chemical and biological properties in the surface waters. What you can see here, perhaps, is a sink, not unlike the kind of sink that you would have at home. The difference is that this sink is connected to a source of seawater that's being continuously pumped from the ship's external environment through to these laboratories. And in our case, we're taking the seawater and running it through a whole bunch of different sensors to measure a number of different chemical properties, as I've said. And the one that I want to focus on today is oxygen. It's a gas that we're all familiar with. You will know, of course, that it is absolutely essential for life on Earth. You will also know, I'm sure, that it's produced by photosynthesis, by plants and algae, microscopic and macroscopic algae, and that oxygen is consumed by all organisms, including plants and algae. From an oceanographic perspective, oxygen is interesting because it provides useful information about the balance between photosynthesis and respiration. That is to say that the balance between the production of oxygen and its consumption. And in a situation where the rate of photosynthesis exceeds the rate of respiration or oxygen consumption, we tend to have the accumulation of oxygen in the upper layers of the ocean. And what this means is that oxygen then becomes an interesting thing to measure in the surface ocean as an indicator of what we would call the net community production, or the rate of photosynthesis minus the rate of respiration. If you need an analogy to understand this, you can think a little bit about your income taxes at the end of the year. You make a gross salary, and some income tax will be deducted from that, and what is left at the end is your net salary. And so net community production is really a measure of the net amount of oxygen after this sort of quote-unquote taxation of respiration has kicked in. And so by measuring the net balance of oxygen in the water, we get information about the balance between the production of oxygen here from photosynthesis, mostly in the open ocean from phytoplankton, and the sum total of all the respiration from bacteria, algae, krill, whales, fish, whatever you want. So this measure of oxygen is a pretty handy indicator of net community production. Of course, there's a lot of complexities involved, but we don't really need to get into those. So what I want to show you is that by taking these instruments that I've shown you in the laboratory of the Amundsen, we can get very highly resolved measurements of oxygen. So this is actually the ratio of oxygen and argon. For our purposes, we can absolutely just assume that this is equivalent to the concentration of oxygen. But it's actually not just the concentration of oxygen. It's a percentage deviation. That's what this delta means. This triangle means a deviation in the oxygen concentration of the water compared to that which we would expect in the absence of any biology. So if we had an ocean with no photosynthesis or respiration, all of the oxygen would exist along this zero line, as shown here on the bottom, or the sort of near the bottom of this plot. The fact that all or almost all of the oxygen exceeds this value of zero means that we have an excess of photosynthesis over respiration. But what's interesting is that we have these patterns of oxygen. So we've got high accumulation of oxygen here, small little features here, and again here, and all throughout this measurement, which is also shown here as sort of a ship track, where the colors denote this oxygen accumulation. Blue values are oxygen very close to zero, or this equilibrium value with no apparent net biology. And the yellows are higher accumulations of oxygen. So these are just two different ways of representing the same observation. And what's interesting is that the oxygen that we see seems to show some pretty interesting coherence or matchups in space with sea surface temperature and sea surface salinity, or the salt content. And there's a couple of really notable features here. For example, this little feature here, this one over here, and that one down here, where we've got these very low salinity waters that are associated here here, and here, where the arrows are, with these little accumulations of oxygen. So there seems to be something going on in these surface waters where we have the accumulation of extra oxygen or extra net community production in these regions where we've got lower salt. And the explanation for this is that in the Arctic, where we have a lot of glaciers and we have a lot of input of fresh water or low salinity water, it turns out that these glaciers themselves are an important source of important nutrients that are helping to drive this accumulation of photosynthesis. And so what these data are essentially showing us is this importance of glacial meltwater in stimulating biological productivity. And by using these kinds of ship-based observations, we get some pretty interesting insights into how glaciers are stimulating productivity through nutrient delivery. At the same time, we also have other sources of fresh water in the Arctic and other potential sources of nutrients. And here's a photograph of myself and the PhD student Robert Isaac on the right, sampling some inflowing river waters to get budgets of the nutrients that are coming in. So these are the kinds of data and the kinds of observations that we can get from ship-based observations in the Arctic. The limitation of ship-based observations is that we're really just sampling a very, very small fraction of the Arctic at any one time. A ship like the Amundsen might cost something like $80,000 or $90,000 per day to run. And so you can see quite quickly that it becomes prohibitively expensive to really sample the Arctic in great detail if we're relying only on ships. And that's where the satellites come in. It's been about 25 to 30 years now that we've firmly entered the era of satellite-based science and satellite-based oceanography in particular. In the modern day, we have a whole constellation of satellites that are orbiting Earth and continuously collecting data on a wide range of ocean variables, particularly those that can be measured right up at the top of the ocean. And the one that I want to focus on is what we would call ocean color. And those of you who have been to Hawaii or Fiji or somewhere very, very tropical will realize that the water is this beautiful, deep blue cobalt blue, as opposed to the more greenish or brownish waters that we have here locally or in other regions of high algal biomass. And the difference in this ocean color simply just reflects the difference in the quantity of chlorophyll and other light-absorbing pigments in these photosynthetic organisms. And just as we can see this with our own eyes, the satellites can also see that. So here's an image, a seasonal composite image for I think it was 2015, for the year that we did our ship-based observations of chlorophyll. Again, these are not real colors. This is what we call a false color image. The yellow color here indicates a high value of chlorophyll, and the blue values indicate lower values. And what we can see is that we have these areas here, here, and all throughout these channels where we have an apparent accumulation of chlorophyll in the water. Now we can look at these satellite observations and compare them against our ship-based observations, and what we see is that there's some coherence. These again are the same ship-based observations of oxygen that I showed you before, and we see that these areas where we tend to have higher accumulation of oxygen, lo and behold, are in general the same areas where we have a high accumulation of chlorophyll as seen by the satellites. So that gives us some comfort because we realize that what we're measuring along a very, very narrow ship track is also allowing us to see something from broader scales as observed from the satellite. So there's something about these two that is coherent in broad terms. Well, now we come to supercomputers, because satellites and ships are great for observing the world as it is now, but they don't give us a lot of information about how the world may be in the future. We can't really predict anything from a ship-based observation or a satellite. And that's where we come to supercomputers to build these numerical or computational simulations of the real world using complex mathematical equations. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into those equations, but let me just tell you in general terms that these ocean models work by dividing the world into these tiny little boxes. And here's a nice representation of what a series of those boxes would look like. This is the United Kingdom, so this is the North Atlantic. And you can see this little tower here represents one so-called grid cell. And that grid cell might be, I don't know, 100 or 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And then It's defined at the surface of the land and then upwards as this tower of these different stacked levels of atmosphere. And below the ocean surface, we also have stacked levels of different layers in the ocean. And we use mathematical equations from geophysical fluid dynamics to make predictions about the transfer of heat and momentum and energy between all of these boxes. So between adjacent boxes in the atmosphere, between the land and the atmosphere, between the land and the ocean and the atmosphere, the ice and the ocean, and so on. And we specify using fundamental physical laws the transfer of energy, momentum, heat, and so on. And that allows us to basically simulate or recreate an ocean based on these numerical properties. Now, this becomes quite useful because if we have some faith in the representation of real processes in these models, we can use them to make some predictions about the future. Now, one of the things that would be of interest to us in terms of understanding ocean circulation is a focus on what we would call ocean mixing. And to understand why that's important, you need to realize that the ocean is separated into different, the waters of the ocean are separated into layers of different density, very much like a bottle, as shown here, of oil and vinegar salad dressing that you might have at home. So this is a mixture of two different fluids. We have an so-called aqueous or water-based layer at the bottom, and above that, we have a layer of oil, some kind of oil, whatever this is. And these layers are separated by density. This is a low density or light layer, and then this is a higher density or heavier layer. And the ocean works in exactly the same way. So if we look at what we call a slice of the ocean down to about 150 meters, evolving over time, what we can see is we have these different colors that represent different concentrations of nitrate, which is a very important nutrient for photosynthesis in the oceans. And typically, the oceans work in such a way that all of the nutrients tend to collect at the bottom, just like all the little bits of good stuff accumulate down at the bottom of this two-phase system of salad dressing. And the only way to get these nutrients up into the surface, and similarly, the only way to get all this stuff up into the surface here is to actually inject some energy and to physically mix it. In the Arctic, that happens during the winter time through what we call convection and other processes. And that mixing turns out to be really, really important as a mechanism of introducing nutrients in the surface. So you can see in the summertime, the nutrient concentrations go to almost zero, and those low nutrients tend to limit photosynthesis. And then every year in the winter, as we're going here, I should explain, sorry. So this is May, June, July, August, and here we're into fall and winter. And in the fall and winter, we bring some nutrients back up, and then photosynthesis kicks in as the ice melts and light becomes available, and the nutrients are drawn down to zero. The point here simply is that these mixing processes are really important for supplying nutrients. So we can look at the numerical outputs from one of these computer models. And what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side here, what I'm showing you using the same color scale where blue is a low value and yellow is a high value. Don't worry at all about the units. Just keep in mind that this is an estimate of the strength of that vertical mixing. So areas as shown here in red, in this red oval, are areas where we tend to have higher rates of vertical mixing. So more energy coming into the system with the potential to transfer those nutrients up into the surface. This is an area of particular interest to me. It's called Hudson Strait, and it's an area where we have very, very fast tidal currents that are driving a lot of vertical exchange through here. And again, what's interesting is that in these areas where the computer model is telling us we should have a lot of vertical mixing, our ship-based observations are also showing us high biological activity based on our oxygen observations. We also have elevated productivity through here, which is another area of higher background mixing, as compared to these very, very low mixing environments here, where productivity is lower. So from these two sets of observations, from the computer model output and our own ship-based observations, we start to build some understanding about the linkages between vertical mixing nutrient supply, and net community production. So to recap so far, when we use ships and satellites and supercomputers in tandem, they give us very interesting and complementary information that helps us better understand a rapidly changing Arctic. As the Arctic is warming and freshening, there are significant changes in the density of those upper layers that are affecting mixing strengths and therefore likely biological productivity. And by understanding the relationship between mixing, nutrients, and productivity, we're in a position to better understand how the system may evolve as it continues to warm and freshen. That warming and that freshening is going to tend to decrease mixing further and potentially reduce biological productivity. So that's an interesting scientific insight in and of itself, and I'm certainly not the first one to say this. Many others have shown it in different ways. A related question, however, is to ask how it is that we make this information most useful to the people who are most directly impacted by the kinds of changes likely to occur across the Arctic. And just as importantly, how do we incorporate very valuable local knowledge into our understanding based on science? And this is actually where I have a connection with the Arctic, with the Vancouver Aquarium, and where I need to signal my gratitude for those connections. Back in 2012, almost 10 years ago now, I was involved in putting together a workshop at UBC through a partnership with the Vancouver Aquarium. And the workshop was put together in the lead up to the program that took us up to the Arctic on the Amundsen in 2015. And for the workshop, we brought together a number of people from different fields to think about what climate change meant for the Arctic in a broad sense, well beyond the domains of any one particular set of expertise. And it was a very, very interesting discussion that launched for me a pretty interesting period of awakened awareness about the importance of understanding the Arctic as a multifaceted system. So once again, looking at these problems through a variety of different sets of eyes. Prior to beginning to work in the Arctic, I had worked in the Antarctic for a number of years. I'd been on cruises throughout the Southern Ocean. And the Antarctic is peculiar in that nobody really lives there. There are lots of scientists, not lots, but there are scientists who live there, there's research stations, but there are no people who live there and have lived there for hundreds and thousands of years and many generations. The Arctic, of course, is different in that respect. And there is a strongly human dimension, a human element of any kind of science in the Arctic. This is a little piece of that cruise track that I've shown you a few times now. We started down here off the coast of Canada, and we ended in Gjoa, which is shown here. And moving beyond thinking about this little hamlet as a place to land a boat and reposition a boat and move personnel on and off, it began to dawn on me that there was a huge source of long-standing knowledge that could be incorporated with the kind of work that we were doing. The question is how one would do that in a way that was respectful and that eliminated or minimized some of the problems of the past, where Western science had effectively been an extension of the colonial arm of the European settlers, where science was almost an extractive process, where scientists would come from outside of community, do their work, and leave in such a way that there was little benefit and sometimes perhaps even some harm to local communities. And so again, working with Eric Solomon and his team at the Vancouver Aquarium, I became connected with the Aquatic program, which had this aim, as you can see here, to connect researchers working in the Arctic with Inuit youth. The idea being to build long-term partnerships based on trust, on collaboration and dialogue, so that Arctic science, as practiced by people living in the South, could be used in service of the priorities of Northern Indigenous, in fact, all communities. And so through talking to Eric and all the others in the Aquatic, I began to embark on this long journey of understanding what it means to conduct science in a way that's truly collaborative and truly supportive of the needs of people who live in these communities. And several years after that, I had the fortune of connecting with a former UBC postdoctoral fellow called Gjoa Haven and his Arctic Eider Society. And what they had done was to put together a really interesting platform. And here's now where we come to the last element around social media. And they created this platform called Syste, which is essentially a way to bridge traditional knowledge and Western science through a common social media platform. And what the platform does is it allows scientific information to exist side by side with local information, with observations from the land, from hunters and trappers, so that these two sets of data and observations can live together and can support each other, so that people who live and work on the land have access to advanced scientific information from moorings, from other autonomous sensors that are deployed. And at the same time, these individuals have the opportunity to provide some input as to, for example, maybe some reports about the kind of animals that they're seeing out in the land. So on the one hand, they may be getting satellite information about sea ice conditions, but on the other hand, also putting in their own data about the animals that they're seeing, the local ice conditions, temperatures, and so on. And it's a way to really bridge these two different sets of observation for the benefit of all parties. And so through the Syste program and through a postdoctoral fellow named Sarah Rosengard that was working with me, we had the opportunity to participate in a number of workshops. Here's some images from one conducted in Gjoa Haven a couple of years ago. And I don't know where Sarah is in this picture. I think she's probably taking the picture. And this is a group of youth in Gjoa Haven with cell phones trying out this Syste app, moving around out on the ice and looking at other data sets that are available on this platform. And as part of the workshop, Sarah had printed out these large maps of chlorophyll. Here's that same color scale that will be familiar. And we blew up some satellite imagery into a large scale. And we worked with some of the hunter and trapper organizations to explain a little bit about what we were seeing as scientists using sophisticated satellite technology, and having them bring their own observations to the table in terms of regions where there were productive fishing grounds, where their own experiences on the land had shown them that conditions were typically very good for hunting and fishing. And that's what's represented here by these dots. And sure enough, the areas where we have these accumulations of chlorophyll are the areas where we have lots of these little dots, which are the hunting and fishing grounds that are productive. So I thought this was a really excellent example of bringing information together from different knowledge systems to really get a much deeper understanding of Arctic system as it exists now and how it may evolve into the future. And I think this is a really good example of seeing the world through many sets of eyes. So I'm just about to wrap up now, but I want to make one final observation about looking at the world through many different eyes. In 2020, there's been a lot of discussion, as I'm sure you're all aware of ongoing discrimination, racial injustice, and all the terrible societal upheaval associated with those things. Scientists are not immune to this, and I would say earth science in particular has a long way to go in terms of reflecting broader society in its own composition. This is I guess about a year-old article by now, published in the New York Times last December. The title is simply, Earth Science Has a Whiteness Problem. And in fact, if one looks across the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, earth science is one of the fields in which the diversity of the global population is most poorly represented. And as you can see here in the subtitle, less than 10% or hardly 10% of PhDs in geosciences are associated to people of color. And I think it's now clear to many of us that this lack of diversity is fundamentally limiting the quality of the research. And the reason it's doing so is for the same reasons I've discussed before. When we see the world through the lens of a particular group of people who don't represent the broader discipline, the broader diversity of society, we are surely losing some outside perspectives, some different perspectives that are going to enrich the way that we understand the world. And so what we are looking for, and what I'm involved in as head of probably the largest earth science department in Canada and one of the largest in the world, is thinking about moving beyond this problem of whiteness and moving into a place where the scientists that we see, the leaders of our field, are much more representative of the true color that exists in the field of earth science. And I think when we truly get there, when we open our eyes and we see through many different sets of eyes and different sets of perspectives, then I think only then are we going to really begin to truly understand the Earth systems. And that kind of understanding is, as I'm sure you know, desperately needed as we face a world that is changing rapidly, and we need all hands on deck to move us towards equitable and effective solutions to living reasonably on this planet as its stewards. So that's a little bit about my journey and my path. I suspect we have some time, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions. So I'll stop sharing and over to you.
Thanks, Philippe. That was a wonderful overview. Your very learned discourse prompted a number of interesting questions. So I'm going to go straight to the chat, and I'll relay the questions verbally to you, and let's use that as for the next step here. This one's an interesting one. Put today's sort of climate in a little bit of geological perspective, from a historical perspective. The question is, has there been a time in the geologic past when the Earth has not had icy polar regions, like the Jurassic, maybe? So we hear a lot about climate change, and this notion that the Earth is warm relative to historical averages, et cetera. We hear a lot about that, but nothing is forever. Any thoughts on geological history and climate and putting today's rapid change in perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. The Earth has certainly existed in climate extremes much more drastic than anything that we're seeing now, or that we probably will see. And if we didn't care about our own species, I don't think that would be a problem. I don't think we need to worry about the Earth system. The Earth system will take care of itself. Even plastic will probably stick around for a long, long time. But as George Carlin, the comedian, once said, Earth left to its own devices would shake off humans like a bad cold. The Earth is not something we have to worry about. It's the Earth as it exists and has existed for a very short period of time, let's say 10,000 years, over which human societies have developed and flourished. So that is really the question. Not so much is the Earth any more extreme in its climate now than it has been in the geological past. The notion is, how much change can our agricultural systems, can our societies adapt to over essentially an instantaneous period?
Terrific. Now, this is a question from me. In the review article you wrote for PNAS recently, you mused about or reflected on Apollo 8. And it's
what, sorry?
On Apollo 8.
Apollo 8, yeah.
And it strikes me that those first photographic images of planet Earth back in the late 1960s almost prompted a phase shift in the way in which humanity looks at itself. And I wonder, if we look at Apollo 8 and those first images, can you reflect on perhaps the way in which oceanography and earth sciences might have shifted as well in the way in which it looked at planet Earth? Because I think a lot of the people online today have grown up seeing satellite images, space shuttle images, all sorts of images from outer space looking down at the ocean or New York City or forest fires in the Amazon, et cetera. Can you reflect on the time since 1960, the late 1969, and those first images of planet Earth from outer space?
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. The advent of the satellite era has certainly changed our consciousness, I think, about the scale of these planetary features. So, for example, we could talk about deforestation of the Amazon as a sort of almost hypothetical thing, unless, of course, we live there and experience it. But for most of the people in the world who don't live it as a daily reality, it's a distant thing. And yet satellites have now allowed us to understand the sheer scale of these changes. Similarly, when we just looked at if you had looked at some satellite imagery from NASA in the last few months about the forest fires from California, we now have the ability to image the Earth in a way that goes so far beyond our individual perceptive abilities. And so I think the Apollo 8 mission and the ability to see the Earth from the outside has, I think, profoundly altered our sense of scale and our understanding of the magnitude of the changes that are undergoing on the planet.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you for that. I've got a question from the audience. Are similar ships, satellites, and supercomputer exercises being done for the northeastern Pacific Ocean? And if so, how does the Pacific compare to what you're seeing in the Arctic?
Yes, so absolutely the same kinds of activities are happening in the Northeast Pacific. The Northeast Pacific is undergoing some of the same shifts in that the problem or the issue of mixing that I talked about, the separation of the surface ocean layer that's generally poorer in nutrients and the deeper layer that is richer in nutrients, that separation seems to be increasing. So we call those different layers or strata, basically sort of strata layers, and that stratification seems to be increasing as the ocean warms. And that is potentially limiting the flux of nutrients into the surface. At the same time, many of you may know that the North Pacific Ocean is a region of naturally low oxygen concentrations. Those oxygen concentrations may be declining in certain areas as the pH of the ocean is also declining and the waters are becoming more acidic. So we do have a lot of instruments and we do have a reasonable number of ships that are going out into the North Pacific to monitor these changes, where the computer models are trying to give us some insight into how fast these changes may evolve under different, say, scenarios of atmospheric CO2 release. So yes, very, very active research in that area.
Great, thank you. I think that's very pertinent because it connects our region to the work you're discussing in the Arctic and vice versa. I've got a technical question here pertaining to one of the first graphs you showed in your presentation. And the question is, why are the nutrients vertically mixed in the winter months?
In the winter months, the surface ocean gets colder, and when ice forms, the salts in seawater is rejected out of the ice crystals and is deposited into the seawater. So in the wintertime, surface ocean waters get cold and salty, and those cold and salty waters become more dense, heavier, and they just sort of sink downwards. And that downward sinking of cold and salty water is a bit of a sort of a churning effect, or what we call convection. And it's that convection that mixes the nutrients.
Great, thank you for that. I think for some people on, perhaps not, but certainly for a lot of North Americans and Europeans, the oceans remain a distant and vast unknown that is best left to scientists, explorers, and the navies of the world. I wonder if you can just muse a little bit here, reflect a little bit on why it's important for everybody to take notice, why the oceans are important for all of us, and why people should implicitly feel quite connected to a healthy ocean or a changing ocean.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The oceans are essentially a fluid conduits of heat, of nutrients, of pollution all around the global ocean. And so the oceans are this ever moving, shifting feature that really actually connects us to each other in a very, very physical way. I remember actually being out on a ship in Fukushima when was Fukushima? 2011 or 12? So around that time, right? I was out in the middle of the subarctic Pacific Gyre, thousands of kilometers offshore, and we saw a screen door floating. And somehow they pulled it up and they sampled it and they deduced that it had come from Fukushima. So all of that material and debris that was liberated in that tsunami and all the ensuing destruction, much of that made its way over the course of several years to our beaches and our coastlines. So the ocean, in a very real sense, is a conduit of pollution across our shores, across our nature, across our nations. It's also a significant controlling factor on the temperature of the atmosphere. It's the lungs of the planet in terms of the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So whether we live in Vancouver or whether we live in Montana or Rio de Janeiro or any place in the world, the ocean exerts a significant imprint on the air we breathe, on the temperature that we experience, on the pollution that washes up on our shores. So it really connects us in a way that is invisible but no less real.
Thank you for that. Now, Philippe, you spoke of this and to this in your, but I'll relay the question and perhaps emphasize one element of this one. And the question is, Speaking of looking at the ocean through different eyes, how does your work intersect with local Indigenous people and communities and their knowledge of how the Arctic is changing and being impacted by climate change? Now, this question came in before your discussion about Akarvik and Kudluktuk and Gjoa Haven, et cetera. But maybe you can just take advantage of an opportunity to weigh in on the value derived from working with Inuit youth or elders or community members, and perhaps use an example of climate change to sort of highlight maybe that conversation or that partnership.
Yeah, I think it comes down to really putting a lot of value in different sources of information that are telling us how the world is changing. As a scientist, I have learned how to work on ships and conduct laboratory experiments and to use satellite data and to use output from numerical models. Those are different sets of eyes that I can use to understand the world. And they're very powerful and they give us a lot of information, but they don't necessarily give us all the information. And I think for much of its history, Western science has assumed an inherent supremacy of its own worldviews over other worldviews, including traditional knowledge. And I think in Canada, if I may say, we are further ahead than they are in the United States, although we're not nearly where we need to be. But there is a rapidly growing awareness in Canada and among those who work in the Arctic that there is huge value in understanding the information that comes from traditional knowledge, which of course stretches back thousands of years and provides a long-term perspective that we can't get, say, from satellites, which have only been measuring since the 1990s. And that information, when it's used side by side with science, not as an alternative or a competing set of ideas, but actually there on the table on some kind of equal footing, provides a richness of observations. And I can illustrate this with a little anecdote that I experienced, I guess it was last couple years ago, whenever it was, up on the Arctic in the Evanston. We had a visit, so we were in Grise Fjord, and we had a visit from a number of local community members on a ship. And we were giving them a tour of the lab and talking about some of the very same results that I was showing you. And I made the point that some of the signatures that we saw in biological productivity were related to these low salinity events. And one of the elders from the community made a comment to me, said, you know, when we hunt seals now, we notice that they don't float up through the ice holes nearly as much. They tend to sink. They tend to sink a lot more. And certainly one possibility is that the water, as it's become increasingly fresh, has a lower density. And as the water has a lower density, the animals tend to sink more than they would if the water was saltier. So if you've ever been to the Dead Sea in Israel with a very, very hard salt content, you can float very well on that. Whereas in a lake, you would tend to sort of sink down. And so it was a really interesting observation, I thought, about how one might perceive a change in ocean salinity without having any access to any kind of quantitative scientific instruments. Just by observing the changes in the behavior of animals, you get a whole different perspective on the hydrographic conditions of the surface ocean. So all that said, you get really interesting insights, I think, by bringing these things together. You incorporate a long-term historical perspective that is very useful. And at the end of the day, you also can ensure that the work that you're conducting as a scientist is actually really serving the needs and the priorities of people who are, as I said before, most affected by these changes.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Where science meets indigenous knowledge meets the food table. When we talk about country foods or indigenous foods, people are out harvesting. They're very connected for food social ceremonial purposes to natural resources, notably some of those aquatic foods and the story that you bring to light here about ring seals. So thank you for that. Perhaps one more question, and then I think we're going to call it a wonderful day. The question from the chat is, if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, how long would the Arctic take to stabilize or stop warming, freshening, acidifying? A tough question, but I think it does speak to some of the discussions around how urgent the need for action is. How long would it take for the Arctic to stabilize?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer to that, but I'll answer in general terms, and that is that if we cut cold turkey today at midnight, and we just turned our CO2 emissions to zero instantaneously, which obviously is not going to happen, we have a fair bit of warming already baked into the Earth's system. So in other words, the cascading effects of warming, acidification, all that stuff will continue for decades into the future, even if we were to stop CO2 emissions cold turkey. So the answer is sort of order of many, several decades. These changes are going to continue to unfold, and there's actually nothing that we can do to stop those changes that are already baked in. That being said, we do have a number of different trajectories ahead of us, and should we choose to aggressively reduce CO2 emissions, then over the next sort of between now and say 2050, there are different trajectories that we can take. But a lot of the change that we're already seeing is going to continue and is already essentially hardwired into the system. So I'm not really answering your question about how long it would take to stabilize, but if I were, I would say it's sort of the order of 3 to 4 decades kind of thing.
Well, thanks very much, Philippe Tortell, for joining us today and providing us with this remarkable insight into your world. I'm certainly delighted to see the reflection on Western science, indigenous knowledge, everything from nano to sort of wide scale and planetary glimpses at the world in which we live. So thank you for that wonderful thought-provoking overview. Congratulations again on your work, and we're delighted to have you on the podium today to accept this award. And we wish you the very best as your career continues to unfold the mysteries here of the deep. So thanks for that.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, Peter. Goodbye.
Take care. Thank you all. And that's it for us from OceanWise today. Stay tuned for more of these Ocean Award lectures as we continue to showcase and feature the speakers, the award winners for our 25th Annual Ocean Awards. That, of course, was Dr. Philippe Tortell, chairman of the Department of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences at UBC, a very worthy award winner for research for this year. Next week, please join us in welcoming Dr. Brett Howard. Dr. Howard is the recipient of the Michael A. Big Award for Student Research. So join us on another wonderful live talk next week. Please share this with your friends and family. Join us online for this very important journey, this connection through the Ethernet to the world around us and the remarkable that we have, as human beings have with our coastal waters and with our wider oceans. So thank you from OceanWise. Stay safe, stay sane, and we'll see you next week.